The rest of the morning. So I'm James Lawless TD, Fianna Fáil spokesperson of technology, and take a particular interest, a bit like Minister Phelan said earlier, political nerd. I'm one of those as well as being a practitioner. I study it and find it interesting and look at what's done here and look at what's done elsewhere and try to learn from those experiences. Is there a clicker? Or clicker for the slides?
Are you there?
Oh, very good.
Yeah.
Very good. So I suppose I drafted a bill which has been mentioned a few times today already, which is in the system. I'll come on to that, where exactly it is. But the gist of it is to tackle some of the issues that we've seen. So just by way of introduction, just to have a quick recap, I think a lot of this material needs little explanation now because I think there's quite a wide awareness between multiple events over the last 24 months or longer internationally. But just a quick recap on what we've seen. Say American elections, the US elections were controversial, to say the least. The slide on the screen shows 3 different ads run by the same campaign group, which are actually directly contradictory of each other. We saw Brexit, the Brexit referendum, allegations of foreign spending, alleged Russian influence, other influences being brought to bear. As we mentioned, offline media, traditional media weren't entirely innocent either. We saw in our own 8th Amendment referendum, and Gavin Sheridan has talked about this in some detail already. Just picked one example. There's many. The undecided on the 8th, which was a Facebook page purporting to be a sort of innocent, neutral third party to give independent, impartial advice, but transpired actually to be very much attached to a particular side. So that's an issue seen very close to home. And in case we think it's a new phenomenon, not so long ago, we had another presidential election, 2011, and we had probably the first incident of Tweetgate in Irish politics in, 7 years ago now. 7 years, as Gavin said, 9 years is an eternity. 7 years is almost an eternity in online terms as well. So we've seen, I suppose, around the world and at home, we've seen examples of how the internet can be manipulated, how those who want to influence electoral outcomes can use social media to do it, which can be very positive. It's very much a democratization. It's very much an enabler, and it gives access to people who may not have means otherwise, but it can be extremely negative when it's manipulated for ulterior ends by people who may be less scrupulous and people who wish to conceal who they actually are and wish to deceive, and often who bring resources to the table to enable them to do so. So what kind of things do people do? I suppose some of the things people do, the obvious is people pretend to be something other than what they are, someone different, but it can be quite sophisticated. The type of things we saw, for instance, in the US elections were false flags. False flag is where you go into battle, the infamous black ops, where you go into battle wearing a uniform of a different army to the one you actually are, because you want to give a bad name to the one that you're pretending to be. You can do the same online. There was evidence of ads being ran. So pro-Trump people, for instance, were running ads allegedly on behalf of Hillary because they wanted to actually sort of besmirch her name in particular quarters, using micro-targeting to give a message that may not appeal to the people being advertised. Wedge issues, divide and conquer. We heard from Dr. Cornier earlier about how divisive issues, wedge issues, were to the fore in much of the foreign influence advertising during many of these elections. And again, that's not necessarily about assisting a particular side, but it's about driving a wedge and weakening that particular democracy. Fake organic, I'm going to talk in a few minutes about bots. Fake organic is where people use bots and use software to drive up a particular post or to drive a particular viewpoint by tweeting, retweeting, liking, sharing multiple times a particular post or a particular piece of material to give the effect of it appearing more popular than it is, and also by gaming the platforms, because the platforms all use different algorithms to sort of push content up or down the feed. So you can game the system if you have access to software, and that's happening a lot. Funding obfuscation, basically people can break the rules around spending because they can conceal who they are. They can throw a lot of money into a particular campaign, and they can get around spending rules, get around spending caps by doing so. And then of course old-fashioned confusion, that goes on as well. Why is it important? We've lots more elections. We've had lots of recent elections. We had the 8th Amendment referendum, we had the presidential election. We've many more coming up. We have the European elections, probably the most pressing international elections coming up in the next 6 months. You see there's a number of, maybe another Brexit referendum, all sorts of elections coming down the track. And it goes back to the fundamental principle that he who pays the piper calling the tune should not be a principle that applies to democracy. In other words, the highest bidder shouldn't always win the election. It's equality of arms. People should be able to bring to the table their own viewpoints, present them, and have a counter-challenge, but in a very transparent, integral way. Current landscape, we heard from Barry earlier from the franchise section, and we heard, I think, a few of the other speakers mention as well. Essentially, our electoral acts, there are many offences in the statute books, and there are many provisions. The majority of them date back to 1992. It was a different time. There was no Facebook, there was no social media, there was no broadband, there wasn't really mobile phone penetration. The World Wide Web was invented in CERN in 1991. So I remember going to Trinity in the late 90s. It was kind of a green screen. We didn't have browsers yet. We were at a very early Netscape. But certainly in 92, it wasn't even that far ahead. It was a green screen. So a very different landscape to where we are today. The electoral acts, I won't read every line of the provision, but just to give a flavour, and it's been mentioned already, there are provisions relating to poster advertising and leaflet advertising and traditional offline advertising, and there are many of them. Primarily, as I say, they're addressed to that sort of traditional materials. The lacuna emerged, I think, very strongly in the last year in terms of we've all this in place for offline advertising, but who's actually in charge of the online space? And particularly in the 8th Amendment campaign, it came up, well, if you have a complaint, if you have a concern, is it SIPO? The answer was no. Is it the ACI? And we've heard that they don't have a responsibility there either. The Referendum Commission said at the start they don't cover online. The BEI don't do online either. The Data Protection Commissioner wasn't really involved to the extent in terms of advertising. Any of the bodies that one might expect turned out weren't responsible, didn't have responsibility in that area. So there's kind of there's nobody left. So it's a bit of a Wild West. I introduced a bill this time last year to the Oireachtas Social Media Online Advertising Transparency Bill. It's been mentioned a few times today. I'm going to go through it now. What does the bill do? The bill essentially tries to tackle some of this, not all of it, because it's a huge landscape, it's a huge challenge, but it tries to focus in on a couple of things which could be done relatively simply, which would improve the landscape and I hope produce greater electoral integrity going forward. I'm quickly going to step through the provisions of the bill. The first thing is it only applies to paid content, so this is a bill to regulate online political advertising, but I've deliberately pitched at paid content only. So a home user that's putting up a blog saying he doesn't like James Lawless, or doesn't like the government, or doesn't like Fianna Fáil, or whatever else, fine. He can bang away and say whatever he or she wants to do, because that is an individual, hobbyist, amateur, regular person, and they're entirely free to communicate whatever they want. However, if they start promoting that post or sponsoring that post or putting money onto it, then it brings in a different league. And I've made that distinction in the bill. It's directed towards a political end, so it's not, it's primarily or only political advertising. Again, I won't read it's a long definition, but the definition in the bill is on a board from the BEI, and essentially it's the existing definition within the BEI of what is a political end for advertising purposes. It covers a multitude of things, primarily promoting a particular party, a particular candidate for election. It also includes trying to influence a legislative outcome, and it can even involve a trade union industrial relations dispute. There is a conflicting definition or different definition within some of the SIPO legislation, and there may be an argument for reconciling the two, but just that's it's very much towards a political end. What does the bill say about all this? It says if you're going to run a political advertisement and you're going to, by definition, spend money on it, you have to say who's behind it. Okay, so that's the bones of the bill, really. So this is an example that Facebook already do. It's a very simple little clicker. You click into an ad, it pops up and says, well, actually, this is brought to you by, because you're interested in this stuff, you live in this area, this demographic, etc. That you see why you're being targeted, and under my bill, this would go further and would say, and also this bill was brought to you by the campaign to elect, whoever, or the campaign to, diselect whoever, or to oppose whatever, and you would actually have transparency of who's behind it. You can make your own free and fair judgment on the content. You can decide if you want to agree with it or not agree with it, but you would know who's behind it. There's a transparency notice. The transparency notice it would be something like the Facebook widget I showed a minute ago, but it's entirely platform neutral. Each platform can make up their own, they can meet the definition whatever way they choose. Also, it does include about the targeted, of the audience, so that comes into the micro-targeting. The transparency notice would have to include some description of why you were being targeted, which goes to the micro-targeting, but primarily who was behind it, who was paying for it, who was publishing it, who the sponsor of the advertisement was. There's a registration requirement. The registration requirement is analogous to when you, at the end of a campaign, somebody files the returns with SIPO, says who they are, where the registered offices, etc. They would be required to do that before undertaking online political advertising. This, I suppose, the other half of the bill, if you like, and I'm trying to do a kind of whistle-stop tour just to look at the highlights, is to ban the bots. Okay. Now, when we say ban the bots, Some bots are good. There's a word of the day bot. There could be, I think I have a bot telling me to go running more often. There's all kinds of bots that we can subscribe to, which actually can be quite useful. But a bot, as I define it, is one which is deliberately being used for political purposes, using multiple accounts. So it's not just 2 or 3 or 4 that someone sets up a couple of fake accounts. I think I've said it as 50 or more, but that's open to debate. But essentially, where somebody is deliberately using a bot to drive fake organic, to drive a particular viewpoint, to deceive the electorate in a very deliberate way, that would be an offence under the proposed legislation. So I talked about the bots, and again, its intention and scale. The hobby user, again, the armchair activist is not covered under this, but the guy behind a suite of laptops running an internet factory, would very much come into the definition. It's not censorship; it's transparency. It's very much pitched in a way to say that the content is immaterial. You can say what you like. It's freedom of expression. It's a free world. But it is a requirement that you must say who's behind it. Who is actually running the ad? Who is sponsoring the ad? Who's behind the post? And if you click further to see why you're being targeted, what's the algorithm behind it? But as regards the content, it's completely agnostic. The bill is agnostic. It's technology agnostic. It's deliberately pitched and drafted in such a way as to apply to all platforms and none. And it's technology neutral. Essentially, I see it as bringing the Electoral Acts into the 21st century, because it's deliberately drafted in a very consistent way with the 1992 and the 1997 provisions around posters and leaflets and pamphlets, but that would be bringing that onto the online space. There are some offences in the Act. They appear at first glance to be quite onerous. They probably are. It is a serious business we're talking about, but again, they're consistent with what's in the existing electoral acts. As it stands, if you put up a poster on a lamppost outside Dublin Castle this morning, and you fail to put a note on the bottom saying who printed it, you're liable to the same punishments. So again, it's consistent with what's already there. I won't go to the regulatory law framework, but essentially the corpus of law, it sits under a regulatory law framework. Would be there is a question about who would actually prosecute. Probably the DPP, as would always be the case in many of these offences. But that's something that could be that's the default, but that can be revisited. Where it's at, just to conclude and say where it's at the moment. I introduced it to the Dáil in November of last year. It passed second stage vote, went through a vote, process passed through the Dáil December 2017. We've now had 3 committee stages. It's at committee stage, which is basically where it gets thrashed out in detail. I want to thank my colleagues Eamon Ryan and Hildegard Naughton, who are here today from the committee, who have been very supportive and very engaged in the bit as well. We're going to committee stage. We've had a number of experts, including people in this room, before the committee giving evidence, very useful feedback to look at how we can tweak and improve it. We do need a money message from government if it is to progress to the next stage to become law. The government needs to give a money message, which basically is a technical device to say they will facilitate any expenses that are associated with passing that legislation. There's a lot of interest, as we said already. There's a lot of stuff going on around the world. There's a lot of interest online. The bill has generated a lot of international attention, and as Gavin said, I think I totally agree with him. There's no reason Ireland can't be a leader in this area. Ireland can't become the first, or an example maybe that others could follow. We've done things like the plastic bag tax. We've done it with different levies. We've introduced the smoking ban. This could be another area Ireland could seek to be an influencer. The bill may not be perfect. It's not a panacea. It's not a silver bullet, but I think it's a solid step in the right direction. I think it solves one particular set of problems that exist, and I think it could be relatively simply done, and I think it would bring a lot of transparency to the table. But I look forward to the debate, and legislatively look forward to any amendments when we get to that stage. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, James. Fascinating. Just really quickly, because I'm aware of the time. The one thing that occurred to me was the bots and how you were actually going to be able to distinguish between the hobbyist and the guy running a Black Mirror style kind of ops thing. You're 50. Seems, and how are you even going to distinguish what's political? These algorithms are pretty general. Even in California, they're having difficulty with actually being able to do this without people. So would you have a lot of people involved, or how do you envisage it working?
Yeah, so I suppose a couple of things. How do you find what's political? And it goes to what Dr. Corney talked about, the stealth advertising. It's more the issue-based advertising, because if it's a political candidate or party, it's pretty clear that person is behind it. They're front and centre. Where it's a bot, I suppose a lot of it goes to intention. It's in terms of when what is the purpose of the bot? And the reason it's pitched at 50 or more is to exclude the sort of armchair activist that wants to run 3 fake accounts that probably shouldn't be doing it, but at the same time I think it might be a bit heavy-handed to criminalise them. So 50, I think the reason I went to 50 is I think on Irish Twitter, maybe others in the audience will can correct me on this, I think you can trend with 50 or 100 tweets, so you know, if you get something going. So it's a relatively low bar to actually achieve a high degree of influence. But I suppose the political definition would come under the BEI definition as it currently stands, if it fits that in those categories. And as I say, the bot's 50 or more, and it's very definitely about intention. So where somebody is intending to masquerade as being something other than, you know, that they're pretending to be 50 different individuals, whereas actually it's 50 people, 50 accounts being controlled by one entity.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. So next we're going to hear from